And we are live. How's it going, everybody? Today we are back with a guest that's no stranger here to Solana news and definitely no stranger on Solana anymore. They account for 40 to 50% of RPC infrastructure and are focused on decentralizing it. On top of that, they have another really big task they're taking on, and they're focused on building an immutable and decentralized storage solution, which Solana somewhat lacks. So, it's going to get a little bit technical, but I've tried to frame these questions so Frank will be able to break it all down to us in nice bite-sized chunks. I do want to preface this with I was kind of curious what this discussion was going to revolve around because you can only talk about things like an IDO so much. And I feel like that's what a lot of people are here expecting to talk about. But once I started to do some research, I came across an amazing podcast with Frank and Knox Trades. So I just want to give a shout out to Knox Trades saying it was amazing listening to kind of Frank and Knox go back and forth on these very technical aspects. And it really gave me a framework and showed me what was exciting. So without further ado, this may get somewhat technical. Frank said he's been baking it for a while, so he's definitely going to break it down. And I'll just add Frank in here and let him take the discussion. So how's it going, man?
Hey, good. How are you?
Dude, it's amazing to have you back on again. And kind of, I was doing this research again for this stream. And last time we met, it was right after the NFT mint. There was tons of excitement. I remember you were just extremely excited because you guys were setting up a bunch of new servers. So I'm
Mm.
curious to just jump back into it because from what I've seen, that was really only the start. You guys got these servers kicked up, the extra servers, put out the free RPC and really just hit the ground running from there. So to
Yeah.
kick things off, I'm just curious for anyone who maybe hasn't been keeping up with GenesysGo, can you explain why your validator and RPC services are so critical?
Yeah. So the I'll attempt to make this the short version. The short version is so validators. For those who don't know, they build the actual blocks that go into the Solana chain. RPC nodes act as kind of the network connectivity layer that connects like your favorite dApps to the blockchain itself, right? So they kind of act as the go between, the load balancing layer, if you will, making sure that the traffic that hits the validators as they're building blocks isn't overwhelming it, isn't getting backed up, and they make sure that the traffic flow stays smooth. And so, excuse me, and so effectively those two pieces, they really make up the functioning mechanisms that actually like power the blockchain as a whole.
Yeah. And that's amazing. And for people who want more information, like Frank, you've probably touched on this a million times by now. So you can actually go back to our video that Frank and I did back a couple months ago. I think it was early November. And we do a complete deep dive into RPCs and validators. And just another follow up question I have here before we jump over to the next exciting feat you guys are taking on. Why is it so important that you guys are handling these RPC and validators? What are the challenges for average users to set these things up?
Yeah, so it's compute is expensive at the end of the day, and so the average user, like if they want to set up a Solana validator, for instance, right? The average user, they have to go first procure the actual hardware, because Solana doesn't play nice with like AWS, like cloud computing, Google, that type of thing. It's cloud compute servers make very poor validators and make very poor RPC servers. And so on Solana, you need like bare metal hardware, which especially kind of at the moment with some of the supply chain issues going on, that can get a little pricey. But then there's also the networking aspect of it, right? It's once you get it down, I wouldn't say like time consuming per se, but it can eat up a lot of your time as you're like watching, having to watch your network, having to watch your servers, make sure that they're staying connected, make sure that they're doing what's called staying on the tip, which means staying at the very tip of the blockchain, constantly writing blocks as they go, and then if not, making sure that you're immediately bringing them back up to speed, which is is something that can eat up a ton of time. And really, like, it kind of becomes a question of like, where's your time best spent? And so, there's a number of challenges, especially as Solana is, a chain that's in its beta stages. Um, and they're pushing out updates. They're actively asking for community feedback and research, and so on and so forth. And so it's a cost saving measure, it's time saving measure, and at the end of the day, it's you kind of want that part of the network architecture to be the piece that's just kind of always running in the background, and you never really notice it unless there's a problem.
Yeah, and that's amazing to hear. And I think it just goes to show the fact that you guys have came and filled this massive gap for RPCs and validators. And I think what's even more exciting is the plans to getting into decentralizing this and
Mhm.
allowing people to use latent compute or compute that's not being used to decentralize and be able to become RPCs in some matter. And we'll get into that down the line.
Mhm.
Something that I think is really exciting and where it starts to get technical, and I'm curious to hear about this all over again, is talking about decentralized storage solutions. So
Mhm.
on that podcast with Nox Trade, you're talking about things with Arweave, Filecoin, and these are very large decentralized storage solutions, but
Mhm.
they have an issue. So
Mhm.
I guess the main thing here is I'm pivoting towards the entire fact that GenesysGo is looking to build a decentralized storage solution for Solana. Should
Mhm.
we start with what's wrong with the current one?
Yeah. So, you know, what we're working on is the first Solana native decentralized storage solution, and why that's important is, Solana it's a very cutting edge blockchain. The proof of history consensus mechanism is very far in terms of its what it's capable of, far and away from like the next closest chains. Which is not to say that any chain is better or worse than any other. It's just Solana built a consensus mechanism. They built a CPU, if you will, that that fills a very niche role that hasn't really been filled by other chains, which is very quick, very cheap transactions. One of I think it was Levi from our team who he used this, came up with this really great phrase that just like resonated with me so much. Right? It's like he said something to the effect of every other chains that everyone should be able to. Or the philosophy of other chains is everyone should be able to run a node, while the philosophy of Solana is everyone should be able to send a transaction. And it's like really elegant in its simplicity, right? Because it basically fills that gap for like for instance a lot of traditional finance companies, right, where they don't need large blocks of data to necessarily be moved all at once. They need super fast, super zippy transactions, and they need to be able to send a bunch of them. And that ability for speed and efficiency that comes with that is what makes Solana really unique. But that uniqueness can also kind of be a little bit of a double-edged sword. Because existing storage solutions like Arweave, Filecoin, they're built on they're built around chains and built for chains that are a lot less performant, and then that causes issues, right? Because it turns out the only thing that can keep up with Solana is Solana. So one thing that we kind of have a little bit of a or had a little bit of a unique perspective on was especially during the NFT boom, where projects, NFT projects are they're trying to upload their metadata to Arweave, and they're trying to, as they're trying to do that, they're connected to our RPC nodes, and we always like ask and seek out feedback from projects that are on our network. We were hearing a lot of like, hey, what's wrong with your RPC? I'm trying to do these uploads and I keep getting failed transactions. Why aren't your RPCs working? And we would have to kind of go back and be like, oh yeah, that's not us. Sorry, that's Arweave's RPC nodes actually, because they like Arweave has like a max TPS of something like 5,000 transactions per second. Solana is like 10x that. And so, when you're sending when you're sending your metadata to Arweave from Solana RPC servers, it's actually like the network bridge, so to speak, is trying to push more data to Arweave than Arweave can handle. So you get kickback failed transactions, which we were actually getting a ton of consistent reports that that actually was resulting in projects having to like double pay because the transaction still consumed the token even though it didn't actually get loaded in the blockchain. And basically, and IPFS has similar issues. It's a different model, but the issues are still the underlying issues are still the same in that it's just not fast enough. And the more that we kind of start to dig into it, the more we realize, especially in the case with Arweave, it is very complex and very, don't get me wrong, very good. Like Arweave is, as I was reading like the white paper and the yellow papers that are, the Arweave team has published over the years. It's phenomenal. Like they built some really incredible stuff. But it's very complex, and Solana doesn't get along well with complex. Because again, as I said, I used this phrase earlier. There's a certain amount of elegance and simplicity, and what we realized is that like Arweave, Filecoin, they both have their own. They all both came up with their own consensus mechanisms, and so you have the data going through the Solana consensus mechanism, proof of history. Then you have them hitting the Arweave consensus mechanism, and that just creates more slowdown, which is fascinating because the data's already been through one consensus mechanism, right? And so that was the observation that we had. But when it really kind of hit home for us was we a few months ago, there was this huge increase in demand for the ability to access historical transactions, and what I mean by that is most people don't realize that Solana validators and Solana RPC nodes, they they all have hard drives and somewhere in the range of 3 to 6, 7 terabytes. What happens is like they store the data from the chain, they store all the data for the blocks they're building. But Solana is so big, the amount of data that Solana pushes is so massive, like 10, like multiple times more than any other chain, that the hard drives actually get filled up, which means once they get filled up, they just go back and they start overwriting the data. And so what we found was we started having projects that are trying to get historical data. They're asking, or they're making RPC calls of the network for, transactions that are older than the 6 to 8 days that an RPC node could store on its hard drive. And they were like, "Hey, we can't find these. If we connect, but if we go and connect to like the public mainnet." The Solana public RPC nodes, which we talked about those a lot in our the last time I was here, we can get access to those. Well, the reason for that is because Solana actually, because and this is kind of through no fault of their own, but the amount of data that Solana was producing expanded so quickly, they needed just an instant, immediate solution that could just scale because they're very focused on finishing the beta testing, if you will, of the proof of history mechanism. And so they kind of had no choice but to just spin up a Google Bigtable instance. So what happened was, and this is kind of where the revelation for us occurred, is that people were just connecting. If they tried to access historical transactions, their request was just being funneled to Google Bigtable, and the Solana public mainnet nodes were literally just reading off of a centralized cloud solution. So, of course, we reached out to Solana, got access to, or got the ability to clone the Solana transaction history, clone their Bigtable instance, and move it over to our own. So then we could also support them in the effort of offering the full transaction, the full ledger history. And that was where it got really interesting / a little scary, because we started to realize like this Google Bigtable is really just a glorified spreadsheet. It's 3 columns and a bunch of rows. And then we started, the more we started to like go in depth with it and play with it. I play with it by mean like play with the connectivity to with it to our network. We started to realize that first of all, Google, they have like something like a 2 to 5% transaction failure rate, meaning every time you try to hit the Google Bigtable instance, 2 to 5% of transactions will fail, which that's actually like considered good on their side.
Okay.
Whereas, on Solana for our RPC network, we've had zero failed or zero what are called 500 errors, basically
Okay.
failure to serve the request, for months. And so that was kind of like, oh wow, this is not good. But secondly, it's the fact that the data is actually not immutable, meaning that it can be changed. And what's kind of the value of a blockchain, right? That the data exists forever, and that it's kind of written in stone. It's immutable. It cannot be
Yeah.
changed.
And just to jump in here, like
Mhm,
those are the two big things, right? You have this big table, all the data is being held by Google, which is
mhm,
centralized. And is that kind of runs in parallel with it being non-immutable, right? Someone can hack into this centralized big table, however they do it, and start trying to change this data for their own benefit, correct?
mhm. Yeah, it's and like fully fully recognizing the fact that would that be easy? No, not by any stretch. Uh, but the fact that it's possible kind of goes against the ethos of what a blockchain stands for, and to kind of compound that. Solana is very big on on trustless mechanisms, right? Mechanisms that don't require trust in any type of centralized entity or figure, and you just have to like trust that they're doing their job right. Kind of along those lines, there's nothing actually that says, hey, the data that's in our Google Bigtable versus the data that's in Solana's Google Bigtable, there's nothing actually like keeping those things like synced up. So there's no what we've kind of coined the term of there's nothing protecting the integrity of the consensus, meaning the consensus reached by the Solana validator nodes. Once it's stored on the big table instance, there's nothing that protects that consensus that was already reached. And to us, that was a huge issue. And so then we started to research, like, okay, well then why isn't why aren't we looking why aren't solutions like Arweave or Filecoin like being more heavily developed to work on Solana? And then you realize it's because that would require kind of a floor to ceiling redesign of the actual architecture of those decentralized storage chains. And and I don't blame anyone for this. It doesn't make sense, right? For, let's say, Arweave to build from the ground up a completely new architecture for Solana specifically. And kind of that's where we had the realization that we already have this massive amount, borderline unlimited amount of compute, and a borderline unlimited amount of storage in coming from two areas, right? One is our RPC network, but the other is all of the latent compute power of computers just sitting at home, right? Like I think it's a 2 terabyte hard drive in my computer, and I've maybe filled like a quarter, no, not even a quarter, I don't know, 200 gigs, 250 gigs of that maybe, which means my hard drive is just sitting there with 1.75 terabytes of just unused storage space. And the more we started to think about that, the more we realized that you know data storage is expensive, compute's expensive, and we kind of already have that in spades. And so as you think about, if you think about RPC networks being one side of a coin, the other side becomes the data, because of the fact that the servers are already writing to hard drives. And when you start to think about connectivity and decentralization, and bringing on what we're now calling shadow operators, uh, that basically allows you to just focus on like the more you decentralize the network, the more storage capacity you bring online, the more compute you bring online, which suddenly makes the issue of gathering those resources kind of moot. And then it just becomes a question of how do you maintain the integrity of the consensus for everything.
Yeah. And just to backpedal a bit, I think there's parallels here to what we talked about last stream. I also just want to say the shadowy supercoders are crazy. Someone just dropped a $20 donation for hosting. So that's amazing. We really appreciate that here. at DeFi Direct. But just to backpedal, because you dropped a lot of information, I'm just hearing a lot of parallels to the same RPC problem you guys solved in the beginning. All these traditional RPC providers were not built to handle the raw amount of data that Solana pushes through. You guys came in and optimized specifically for this, and now you're looking to do the same with the decentralized storage solution. I
Yep.
guess my next question is if you guys do have all this compute, is there anything stopping you once you are happy with where you're at with Solana? And maybe you never are because it's always a game of scaling further. Is there anything stopping you from jumping over and providing these services for other networks? Would you just use their consensus mechanisms as well? What is the thought process behind that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one thing we've observed is it's difficult to go from other chains to Solana.
Okay.
Going the opposite direction though is actually pretty easy. We did some looking since our last conversation. We did some looking, and we could basically one of our servers right now could hop over to other chains, and depending on the chain, one of our servers could provide the same amount of like compute power, if you will, as anywhere between like 5 and 25 servers for other chains, because the compute the resource requirements are just so dramatically different for Solana. So kind of to your point, right? It's a question of like, what does Solana do over the next several years as it continues to grow and scale? But yeah, like basically, the only thing that is really stopping us from taking this and recreating it on other chains is simply installing the configs for those other chains, servers.
Yeah. And I'm curious, I have another just more rabbit hole question here. Is
Yeah.
there a specific reason why Arweave has its own consensus mechanism on top? Is there extra layers of decentralization, or is it a little bit redundant as you're saying it's already coming through one before?
I think that's it's an interesting question because as I look at it, and again, this is purely just my opinion, right? As we think through as we've been thinking through what we're building, because again, Solana is such a unique use case. Arweave's consensus mechanism is largely built around uh, the fact that the data exists, the data hasn't been changed, right? We have with Solana a very unique viewpoint in that we're already kind of in the pipes that all the Solana data travels through, which means there's connections that all the validators share with one another where they talk back and forth, and all of that data it's already hashed, it's already encrypted, it's already sharded, and it's already redundant, which means it's like on Solana, it's not so much a question of recreating all of that because it already exists. It's a question of like, how do you take this massive amount of data just like straight to the face and then do something with it. It's like it's like getting hit with a tsunami of data. And what we're kind of building is like this massive structure, right? That's able to absorb the shockwave of that constant stream of data and then channel it into something usable for developers and community members. I think Arweave, the way that they built basically they set out to build a blockchain. They set out to build. They wanted to build an actual unique consensus mechanism. It was a very fascinating academic experiment that was then moved into a pragmatic real world setting, if you will. We're kind of approaching it from the opposite lens, right? We're approaching it less from the lens of let's call it academia, and more from the lens of pragmatic what is needed right now in the moment. Like Arweave it has a lot of moving parts. Its consensus mechanism, for instance, is designed to give you the knowledge, right? That when you store data on Arweave, that and pay, because the cost model is built around this philosophy also. They're basing everything on the thought process of, you want to store your data for 200 years or more, right? And to date, I think they have something like 11 terabytes of data stored or something like that. And that's kind of like it, because they're very focused on the academic aspect of like, how do we store data for 200 years, which that kind of begs the question of like, do you want your data stored for 200 years? Is it possible? And so like data on Arweave, it costs like I think it's 8,000 Arweave equivalent, 8,000 USDC of Arweave tokens to store your data, because you're paying for 200 years of storage all at once, right? And that's largely where it kind of gets passed through the consensus mechanism, or that's why it gets passed through the consensus mechanism, because effectively the consensus mechanism is saying, yep, the data is here. We have verified that we've stored it, and now they're consistently running that consensus mechanism to verify that that data is still stored for, like I say, the next 200 years. And this is where I say, it is an academic approach from the lens of academia, because the way we stored data 200 years ago versus the way we store it now, it's incompatible, right? Completely night and day. And Arweave's own yellow paper, it's on the last page, I believe, talks about that they automatically assume that whatever data they're storing, as they put it, will be subsumed by a more efficient data storage solution at that point. That will exist at that point in time. So if, let's say, 50 years from now, we crack the code to DNA data storage, which could store all the world's data many times over. If we crack that code in 50 years, then that means Arweave's already assuming that, yeah, everything will just kind of be moved over into that, which means you've paid for 50 years, you've gotten 50 years of value for your 200 years of storage, and you basically like just lost 150 years of value. So if you think about Arweave as kind of that academic experiment, with 11 terabytes of like total stored data, we are at the moment, as we think about more through that pragmatic lens, we've already built out a storage solution that actually works, but we currently have like something like 10 petabytes, or no, we will have 10 petabytes by next month of available storage, and that's like 1,000 times the size of Arweave, right? And
Yeah.
so we're basically coming on the scene because we're approaching it from this less academic lens and more pragmatic lens. We're basically coming onto the scene of Solana with 1,000 times more capability than Arweave has at the moment.
Yeah. So there was a lot there. I had to get up for a second because
Yeah, I saw
the
that.
the classic stream there, the sun starts coming up and I get absolutely blinded and I couldn't think about anything except the sun in my eyes. So I do have a couple of questions there. One really big thing I took is data is expensive. This is just a common theme that I'm learning now. So I'm curious, there's a few things. How much storage does Bigtable store? How much is Bigtable? And then I kind of already know the answer to this, so I'll just let you explain this here. How much is Bigtable? How much data is on there? And isn't it already just more than Arweave has itself currently? So these are kind of the issues we're seeing.
Yeah, so that I'm glad you touched on that last point, especially because yeah, like right now, God, I think the Bigtable instance that we have brought up, or that we spun up, which again is just the absolute like, and this is the same one that Solana has running. It's the absolute like last or littlest bit of, or excuse me, the least amount of data possible to say that you're storing the ledger, right? That least amount of data possible, I think, is something like we've got something like 50 or 60 terabytes, which that means that Solana's historical transaction data, just the most bare bones, like I gave you a token and you gave me a token back, and all that little row in that spreadsheet shows is that that transaction happened. That little bit of data is 50 terabytes for the entire chain all the way back to the Genesis block, which is 5 times bigger than all of Arweave. So just like from the get-go, if Arweave were to try to solve Solana's problem, it would require them to scale up 5x, right? It also would cost something like, I don't know, last time I checked, and of course the price fluctuate, but between like 400 to 500,000 USDC equivalent of Arweave to just to put the Solana data on there. Right now on Bigtable, and again, these numbers they always kind of fluctuate, right? Solana is well, let me rephrase that. I think Arweave or not Arweave, the Google Bigtable instance, costs us something like I don't know, 10, 11, 12 grand a month to store to be able to provide access to all that, and that's just what is like stored now. That's not counting like the data, right, as it grows. So that means like the Solana chain is growing, significantly on a monthly basis, right? It's like terabytes and terabytes of data being added to that Bigtable instance every single month. So so as you kind of like think about that, the scale or the necessity of scaling suddenly becomes a very important issue. And that's where Google obviously has the ability to scale for days, right? And for years, scaling's not an issue for Google. Question becomes, how does Solana scale into that kind of data use, right? How does Solana want to pay whatever they're paying for, also not just the storage, but the compute that Google provides to access that storage? And again, kind of as we said earlier, right? What are the two things that we have in spades here? It's compute and it's storage. So like we can store what if our current storage capability is 10 petabytes, that's about 1,000 times Arweave, 5x. So you figure we can store the entire, not just the entire chain, but the entire account state, which is like literally the most expansive amount of data that any developer could want. We probably can store that like 10, 15 times over.
Yeah, that's incredible. And what I kind of got there from the data being expensive, you have this extremely expensive up here decentralized data solution, 400, 500K. And then you have this centralized data solution where, if you really think about it, you guys have spun up your own big table. So you can double that initial cost. And that's almost cool. That's a double check, but it's still not immutable and decentralized. So you
Right.
have this massive gap in value here for compute. And it sounds like GenesysGo will slot somewhere in the middle. You're saying there's demand for this data. I'm curious, would Solana want to pay for more than just this basic open and close price type data? Here's your transaction. If not, who would be interested in paying for this more inclusive data? I think in the Knox Trade podcast, you're describing it as more, okay, what happens between that daily candle? Is there demand for that extra data? If so, who's going to be paying for it? And I imagine Solana would want to pay for some of it, obviously having a more immutable and decentralized solution. But have you thought about where else this demand can come from?
Yeah, and this like plays into the real demand for the shadow token, right? Which is a lot. It's a lot of borrowing from the Solana or from the Filecoin and Arweave tokenomics, in the sense of like the token's utility. But it's the answer to that question is basically every developer. So every developer will use it in some form or fashion, or will use in some form or fashion as their dApp scales. Will be able to like make use and get value out of having the full range of all data that occurs that Solana produced. But I think more importantly than that even is the fact that, because right now the historical transaction data is all that you have access to, that most bare bones data is all you have access to, that means that we're missing out on a lot of potential innovation, because you don't actually know what's going to be created until someone creates it. And there's a ton of things that can be done that we're missing out on by not having access to or by developers not being able to access the historical records for, like again, what's called the account state, right? That kind of what happened in the in between. I think Stephen had a really good analogy for account state that I'll probably butcher, but if you think about the ledger as your payroll system, all that historical transaction captures is on Jan 1, here's the employees that were on your payroll, and on December 31st, here's the employees that are on your payroll. It only shows you the employees that were there from start to finish, but there's a whole range of change that happens, right? You had people join the payroll and leave the payroll along the way. There's a whole bunch of change that doesn't get reflected in there. And what I get concerned about is as I said, the cool things that could be done with that data, the cool analytics that could be done, the ways that they could potentially improve Solana if developers had access to that and could go in and play with that. The way that DeFi could be improved and NFTs could be improved if developers could just if they could just have a playground to go play with that. And that's in my opinion a loss not only for Solana, for developers, but also for the community. Because if you think about like the NFT boom that's happened on Solana over the past 3, 4, 5 months, it wasn't until I don't know, maybe 2 months ago, you started to see a lot of these really cool projects come up with NFT analytics. And like what happens, what were those NFTs doing, what happened to them, how are they existing, and without even like the big table instance, that those wouldn't have been possible, right? So you think like projects like soul analysis, for instance, right? Like they couldn't function without the access to the historical account state or historical ledger. So I don't know, that's the piece that bothers me the most.
Yeah, and that's amazing. So what I kind of did here is I wanted to set this up. What are you guys building? Why is it so important? The revenue here. And then it's just this big key question. And we touched on this definitely in the last stream. It was more near the end, but I definitely want to bring it up now. We talked about true decentralization. You guys have this massive network. I purposely threw out in the beginning that you guys have 40 to 50% of, or you're running 40, 50% of the RPCs. How do you aim to get true decentralization? And maybe this is when we can start getting into your terms. It sounds like you almost have three different ones. You have the shadow network, the shadow protocol, and then the actual users themselves, if I'm correct. Do we want to sort of outline here? And maybe you can start with how are you guys going towards this decentralization compass? Because you have a
Yeah.
massive onus with all this compute.
Yeah. So the broad call it umbrella of really everything that we're building. We coined the shadow protocol. It's meant to be the network that is the network that shadows Solana, right? So it's meant to be very much a nod, so to speak, to as Solana goes, so do we. As Solana scales, so do we. Because if you think about, again, I use this, I touched on this very briefly in the beginning, but if you think about Solana as a computer, right, the consensus mechanism, the proof of history consensus mechanism, that's the CPU. Right, that's actually like performs transactions. The RPC network, is kind of akin to the RAM in the system, right? You can have a super fast CPU, but you need super fast RAM, right, to be able to funnel funnel transactions around, funnel resources around. And we we kind of built out the RAM for Solana with the RPC network. We're now building the hard drive and inserting a true hard drive into the Solana computer. And so again, this shadow network, the shadow protocol, really consists of two parts, right? The RPC network, which again, we're calling that's the shadow network. That's the network of RPC servers that we have. And then the second piece is the shadow drive, right? The hard drive of it. And so the drive and the network are two sides to the same coin, and that coin shadows Solana, which which, again, as we think about it, that hypothetically would mean that as more transactions start to funnel through Solana, as more what's it called, data gets produced by the Solana chain, we will need more what we're calling shadow operators, people that are like individual operators that are running servers on their own, providing compute power, providing storage capacity, and then earning emissions. Because the one thing, you can spin up a Solana validator and you can be an independent operator powering the CPU of Solana, but there is no layer right now, because we're building it, or I guess we've built it. I guess more turning it into a rewards layer is maybe a better way to put it. But there is no rewards layer for supporting the RAM and the hard drive of the Solana computer, and that's really the focus of what we're building, because we don't want to. Yeah, I think I've said this many times before. We don't want to be like the AWS of Solana. That is, I think any project that's saying they want to be the AWS of a blockchain is completely missing the point of blockchain, right? And so it's what we want to do is we want to embrace like kind of the true Web3 ethos of everyone has access to information, which is that's the Web2 ethos, right? Is Web2 is all about access to information for everyone. Web3 layers in ownership, right? Web3 is about information, or is about access to the network and ownership of the network. And the decentralization piece is really what we're really what provides that ownership aspect. And so we actually have a closed pool of 20 or so shadow operators that are currently beta testing and actually are currently serving like live traffic in our RPC network, and then doing it flawlessly at the moment. Which I think tomorrow Steven's doing a tech talk where he kind of walks through some of that technology, and kind of like shows like the real world examples of how it's operating. And so where it gets, like I say, really interesting is the more that we start to decentralize, the more that we start to bring on shadow operators that are running their own nodes, the more we not only spread compute, the more we reduce our server costs, right? The more it becomes a lot easier for the scale of the network to increase many times over, because now you have many people sharing in the ownership of that. And the Web3 ethos of this is that you can have something with like a high overhead, just as high of overhead as infrastructure does. But if you decentralize it enough, then the cost to carry that becomes almost insignificant, to the point where you can actually provide rewards that offset the expenses. So now you have a situation where RPC our RPC network is free. Our full powered, full everything RPC network is completely free. And we're able to do that because we use our NFT royalties that pays for the whole network. So that decentralization, or that looking at the ways in which to get creative with generating revenue that decentralization provides, that can be extrapolated into a situation where the provider, us, we win in the sense that we see our network grow, our services expand. The user of our services wins, because they're not having to pay a cost to access these services. But then the individual, like the community members, the people that are providing the compute, they also win, because they're getting emissions that offset hopefully pretty well any of their costs around compute and storage.
Yeah, so the idea here is, in the beginning, you guys will be able to incentivize these shadow operators to jump on. And I imagine the goal here is you guys already have a head start, right? Even with these 20 operators, I imagine it's a small fraction of the actual, they make up a small fraction of the servers that you guys run. The idea here is incentivizing enough people to where the servers that GenesysGo houses just become a smaller part of this network.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the real question in here is, once the incentives run out, I guess the idea is to then find ways, as you're saying, streaming in the revenue to become the incentives versus just token emissions. Would that be correct?
Well, so it's yes and no. We have the way we've structured our token emissions is, we can support something like 1,000 shadow operators for about 25 years. Meaning that the emissions aspect, the emissions portion of the shadow network would not run out for 25 years if we like hit 1,000 operators from day one. As the price of the token increases, that would hypothetically increase that run rate. And so that's one aspect of it, because again, technology, it moves. I think if the past 10, 15 years have shown us anything, right, like technology moves incredibly quickly. And so 25 years from now, I highly doubt blockchain, I mean, heck, 5 years from now, I doubt blockchain will look anything like it does right now. Which that kind of demands the ability to be agile. And it's interesting, because that's where, again, I think, like Arweave kind of, because they approached it more from an academic lens, that's where I think they start to lose some of their edge, broadly speaking, not just in Solana, but broadly speaking, because they lose that ability to be agile. But the other piece to the like our tokenomics, kind of circling back to your question, is that if and when those emissions run out, 25 years from now, the plan is to have the network be built in such a way that it is completely self-sufficient. It doesn't need us to run it. It doesn't need us to even be involved, right? That's true decentralization. Like Bitcoin, if you think about Bitcoin, right? Like, we don't know who like Satoshi actually is, and yet Bitcoin just runs. That's a big part of our building philosophy, which means that our tokenomics and the structures that we're putting in place are effectively set up to where as those tokens, like if those tokens were to start to run out, rather than doing like a firm like what do they call it, mint and burn tokenomics, it's more of a mint and recirculate with a time frame that effectively is kind of the equivalent of burning when you think about a token's lifespan, a blockchain's lifespan, and how long 25 years actually is.
Yeah, so you almost have this system where the people who are paying the data may or may not be paying in tokens, but the idea is what they're paying gets recirculated to the actual users, the shadow operators, giving compute to the network and kind of
Right.
just making AWS but decentralized. You guys aren't taking the payment.
Mhm.
You're actually spreading it out across. It's more of the user is paying the actual person who's computing it, and there's thousands of people computing it.
You got it. Yep, you got it.
That
And then
makes
you
yeah.
get into some really interesting potential mechanics, right? Because Arweave and Filecoin, the way that their tokenomics are structured is it's a very legacy business mindset, if you will. It is, if you want storage, cool, give me token, I take token, you get storage, right? Which ultimately results in like you having to purchase the token. Now you are, if you will, net negative in terms of, because you just bought token, you just gave token to me, and you kind of have to. Then it's on you, right, to go use the storage that we're providing in such a way that you can end up making more elsewhere. Web3, and like, this is disclaimer, right? It's not like, this is not fully baked. This is us exploring and continuing to push that mindset of agility. Web3 provides some really cool mechanisms that don't exist in the legacy worlds. In the legacy world, one of those, for instance, like is staking, right? Staking is if you delegate tokens to the network, to the Solana network, right? You are a part owner of the network when you delegate to a Solana validator, right? The validator is using your tokens to vote on blocks. But when you unstake your tokens, you are effectively saying you want to give that ownership, you want to relinquish that ownership, you want to take your tokens, and you've been at that time getting emissions or APR with Solana validators. But what if you are somebody that wants storage? Well, what if rather than you having to pay me tokens and we lose those tokens, right? But let's say you don't want to have something stored for years and years and years. You want something stored, let's say temporarily. Why couldn't you stake instead? Still removes tokens from circulation. It still creates demand for those tokens. But when you're done with storage, maybe you shut down your project or something, who knows, right? Maybe the data is no longer applicable to the use case that you had for storing that data. Who's to say that you can't unstake those tokens? And like you're saying, all right, I don't want to own my little this little irrigation ditch that's been carved out for this massive flow of data that's coming through. You now get tokens back that you can go proceed to provide to someone else who does want storage, right? Potentially that could result in a net positive for you. So again, there's just so many interesting and fascinating things about Web3 that I think they're not explored. They're not really tapped, and I think they're just waiting for a team that is depending on, I guess, the outcome, either brave or stupid enough to to go explore them.
No, now that you're saying this a second time, just this half-baked, so to say, idea of staking on the network to get data, it's somewhat similar to a subscription model, still not, because you're not really paying for this month of data, but in the sense where, look, I need this data for a little, I'm going to go stake, I don't need the data anymore, I can take it out. And you're 100% right in the sense that it's still increasing demand for the token. People are still going to want data. Something I'm just assuming here, and I think it's fine to make sense of,
Yeah.
is that at this point in time, we still need infinitely more amount of data and compute. Like, networks are still growing.
Oh yeah.
So even though, and I think this is the true harnessing of Web3, you guys aren't looking to gouge like, okay, we're going to trade this money for this data. It's okay, you come and own this part of the network and get the data that you need. And if you don't need it, you can go give that network back to someone else. It's almost, you guys aren't extracting value from the network and keeping it from yourself. You're just moving this value around to whoever values it the most. And
right.
That seems like a true sort of encapsulation of Web3, not having this overall thing such as AWS that is gouging for the data.
Yes.
And it's a positive sum game for someone like Amazon, but then for all the users and everyone else, the majority, this data, it's just being used and they're getting paid. Whereas this is more so, okay, let me own the data for a little bit if I need it. If you want to own it forever, you can. So
right.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Getting into a little bit further, where do the NFTs play a role in this? And I think you guys nailed the tokenomics on this down. So it's not like the value is jumping from the NFTs to the token. It's almost a whole of an ecosystem. And then I'm curious, on top of the NFT staking, what other things are you guys thinking about doing in that realm?
Yeah. So the NFT was it was an experiment that I'm pretty sure at this point we can say it was successful. And that was just kind of taking a crude stab, if you will, at decentralizing the one of the most centralized aspects of the business cycle for projects, which is that early stage funding piece, as projects try to grow and try to scale. And that was we kind of had a thought process of we're pretty far down the line in talks with different VCs, and as we're talking, it was kind of one of those things where it's like, we're having a lot of focus on potential token and early equity and so on and so forth, and it was it just kind of kept standing out to us that it's like, this is not very Web3 if you will. It's still very much centralizes the ownership aspect of that particular stage of a company's life cycle, a project's life cycle. And so as we kind of like we're going through a process, we realized like, I think there's a cool opportunity here. And that opportunity was at the same time that I think the ecosystem was kind of starting to suffer from NFT drop fatigue. And we kind of wanted to do something that would push, at least begin a conversation around innovation for NFTs and how important that is, because there's such an untapped piece of technology that is really, really cool. And so effectively used our NFT as a access card, a key card, if you will, to the seed token allocation of our tokens that is normally just reserved for insiders, VCs, that type of thing. It was never about keeping VCs or insiders out. It was just about letting everyone else in. And as I say, I think that's turned out pretty well so far. And then like the mechanism by which people access those their portion of seed tokens is we built our own custom NFT staking contract that basically pegs that NFT's portion of the seed tokens to the token ID of that NFT. So that way, it'll only ever get paid out this much in tokens, and then you just go stake it, and they start to vest daily, and you can claim your tokens as often as you like. But what's cool about that is that basically gives like a full year of the NFT, where people have to have it staked in order for the vesting to occur. There's some really cool stuff really cool rabbit holes we could go down around like how that kind of turns the NFT into a synthetic asset of the actual token. But the nice thing about that is that kind of gives a year of not focus on the NFT, so to speak, because we're not an NFT project at the end of the day, right? We're an infrastructure project, but the NFT is, I think, has become such a core piece of like what we do, that we're always going to be thinking about like new use cases, new utility cases, but it's always going to be around utility, and that I think is what's always going to like set the SSC NFT apart from other NFTs, is that as we identify ways or a need, I guess, as we identify pieces of our network, our architecture, our roadmap, and those pieces can be solved with an NFT, then we can use the SSC NFT to solve that piece because it's already built, right? And we're big fans of, again, not overcomplicating, not building multiple parts when you don't need to. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. So I think it's one of those things where we're always going to be on the lookout for it, but we're also not going to try to fit a round peg into a square hole.
Yeah, and this just gets me excited because this wasn't even the idea of the project. This was just an innovative way for you guys to launch an entire rework on the IDO ICO model. You have a built-in vesting system all into the NFTs. You guys straight up took the NFT and said, okay, we're going to use this to try to make a very efficient and fair fundraising process. And in hindsight, it's so easy for me to say, okay, this makes so much sense. It's revolutionary and sick. And there's two sides to this: the hindsight aspect of it, and of course, this is not financial advice, but it's watching this NFT go from 2 to 70 floor, and that's just the very apparent knock on the head. The non-hindsight part is you go and you look back, and it's like, oh wait, this was outlined from the beginning that what this NFT is an access card to be a seed investor in this RPC and now decentralized storage solution. And you just look back in hindsight, and what makes me excited is you guys took the NFT and said, okay, how can we do this, especially when you look at Solana. And I've been referring to this blog a fair bit, but Kobe put out, there's a big difference between getting in early as a retail user in Solana DeFi versus something like Avalanche or BSC DeFi. And that's just because a lot of VCs came in and funded a lot of these projects and were able to get favorable deals. So by the time a lot of these DeFi protocols were coming out onto the market, they were pretty fairly valued versus a lot of community upbringing. But to see you guys be in the space where there is a fair amount of VCs, I'm sure you had a ton of discussions, but to take a step back and be like, wait, how can we get everyone involved in this is incredible. And just watching it step by step, the real hindsight for me is like, oh, this was all laid out. And the big thunk on the head is just watching this NFT pump all the way up. And it's like, oh, this makes so much sense. But that was just very exciting watching all that happen. And the fact that, look, this is a little small subsect of how do we decentralize this from the beginning? And I think that ties back into my entire question of, okay, you guys do own this massive network right now. How are you shifting this onus? Just seeing that you guys have started doing that from the ICO, the seed phase, gives me confidence that you guys are looking and at least thinking about the most optimal way to do this moving forward. And that's what the shadow operators and all of that get to. I'm starting to get near the end of my questions here. This was just incredible. I think hearing about what you guys are pivoting towards, finding the solution for this decentralized storage solution is amazing. I'm going to take the time now. I have a couple smaller questions here.
Yeah.
If anyone in chat wants to drop anything in, Frank will probably be able to scoop that up. I'll be able to relay that question to him. For the time being, we have the IDO coming out. Maybe you just want to give a short little outline on that. And then you do have some also short-term token opportunities for liquidity incentives on Orca that are coming soon. I was just perusing through the medium there. So maybe you just want to outline the process of what it will look like if you own an SSC, how the IDO will look, how the actual IDO itself will look, and then what is the benefit for users who may not have an SSC currently. So that was kind of a loaded question, but you can try to pick that apart there.
Yeah. Hey, sorry, my dogs. So I think the benefit of the NFT is, or the benefit to participants in the ICO is, the fact that the shadow network is very. It's a lot sooner than I think most people realize, simply because of the amount of compute that we have, and that compute is compute and storage, I should say. And that's, like I said before, that's really the hardest aspect to everything. I think the NFT was designed, the NFT mint, was designed to reward, community members who, effectively, like, were willing to take a swing, right? They effectively were willing to, like, come in and be mini VCs, if you will, and that's, super, that deserves recognition. There's I think a very healthy debate going on at the moment of, like, what's now the better play to, is it is it buying the SSC NFT from the market, or is it getting the tokens from the ICO or from the IDO? And I think that's a debate that I don't think there's a good answer to, and really is would put us into kind of like wading into the middle of borderline starting to give financial advice. That's, I think, a decision that individuals have to make based on, kind of their own situations, based on their what they think's possible, and, candidly, how much liquidity they want to have in the beginning. Because I think the key thing to remember, right, is the way the NFT staking will work is that you will deposit the NFT, or you will stake the NFT into the staking contract, and then you will have emissions of tokens over time. And those emissions of tokens over time are very much they're meant to resemble that kind of a vesting period, trying to be like less restrictive in terms of the vesting period than what is normally seen. But those, as I say, yeah, those it represents, like I say, the vesting period. And so the vesting period is it's important because, you know, the original like minters of the NFT, those who held from the beginning, you know, they got in at like 2.5 Sol, right? And at the time, Sol was hitting an all-time high, hit its all-time high, so it's like 600 and something bucks for each NFT. The difference, obviously, in terms of where, you know, like that puts them in terms of their cost basis versus where it could potentially be in the future is pretty large. So the trade-off there, of course, is the lack of liquidity, in the sense that, you know, you're only getting, I think it's like something like 27 tokens a day if the NFT is staked, and of course emissions stop if you unstake the NFT. So yeah, so that's kind of my way of dodging that part of the question.
Yeah, and just to better clarify my question, I guess the main thing is there's a couple different ways people can get involved in
Mhm.
the ecosystem, and the game theory is really up to whoever wants to get into it. It's not ours our position to let anyone know how to do this, but you can either get this vested interest via the NFT, and have the vested interest. Granted, the market is now pricing it drastically different than it started, or you can jump in and just jump into the IDO. And that's just
Mhm.
really what the decision comes into there. It's not like
Right.
you need the NFT to do the IDO. That was kind of
Oh
what
yeah,
I was
no,
trying to clarify.
my bad. Yeah, no. So yeah, the NFT is not at all required to participate in the IDO. The IDO is, you know, it's obviously open to everyone, anyone. The way the IDO works is there is we modified the Aurori Mango smart contract, our IDO smart contract, uh, and we like that one because of the fact that it gives. Uh, it's battle tested. It's, you know, we know the code works. We know the code works for very large IDOs with a lot of traffic, so we don't have to worry about there being any issues, basically. But basically, yeah, we have it set up to where, you know, there's a contribution or deposit phase. You deposit the USDC, and you know, deposit the amount that you want, and then after 24 hours, then we look at the amount of deposits, and it kind of runs off of the laws of supply and demand. You know, if the demand is much higher than the supply, obviously the price, the initial price of the token increases. If the demand is much lower than the supply, then at that point it's so we put a floor price in for each token of 50 cents per token, um, and that floor price is that floor price is kind of there. It's designed to be there because we know how much we need in order to build the shadow drive. Um, and so as we're working through that, as we look at that floor price, if the demand is not there, then effectively what happens is the tokens, any unsold tokens, because of the demand not being there, those just will end up acting as a treasury of sorts. So demand much higher, no treasury. Like this at no point, like the goal of this is to have as many tokens in the community as possible. If the demand is much lower, that doesn't change what we're building, which means we're still going to turn around and build what we're building. Uh, but at that point, then basically saying, okay, the market disagrees with us when that our thought is that, you know, the value of each token is about 50 cents from the get go. Uh, the market can disagree with us also on the upside, and so yeah, so like I said, that contribution phase that lasts 24 hours, and then of course you can go co-redeem your tokens after that.
Yeah, and that's awesome. I love the system and the actual thought that's behind it. And the idea here is you guys are going to go spin up more compute and storage with this. So
Right.
that's the
Mhm.
same thing we talked about with the NFT sale, and it's amazing. To wrap things up, it just really comes down to there's a couple different ways to get involved. Obviously, the best way to get involved was to be one of these people who took the risk and jumped in
Mhm.
early and really wanted to support what GenesysGo was doing. But now there
Right.
is, for all you traders, a little game theory scenario to think about
Mhm.
there, how you want to enter. Um, but at the end of the day, it shouldn't necessarily change your entire thesis. But we'll wrap up that question. There's a couple questions that came in here near
Mhm.
the end. People are asking if you guys sell validation nodes, and this is part of your service, correct? You guys will spin up all the hardware, get everything for the validators, and then I think a quote from you is, then the projects will go do the hard part about getting the Solana staked in there.
Yeah, yeah, and we're actually taking that a step further. We are so we've open sourced all of our RPC configs. We're actually open sourcing and creating a step-by-step, super easy guide to spinning up your own validator. So effectively, we're also, because a big thing for us is decentralization of IP, decentralization of knowledge, and I think right now one of the things that we've discovered is like as we built validators, we built an RPC node. One of the things we discovered was that like if you want to build a validator, you got to go to kind of a hodgepodge of different sources to actually like get all the configs together. There is nobody's put out like a step by step, just I want to spin up a validator, do this, then this, then this. You have to have a certain amount of technical expertise, so to speak, and we want to remove that, so that way, people hopping into, validator channels and other discords aren't met with, look, bro, go figure it out, because again, this is meant to be as inclusive as possible. What we're moving into, and there's also a piece where the Solana server program, which is also referenced in our GitHub, is that is Solana's way of also backing the thesis of decentralization, the focus on hardware should be accessible, and so we've actually found that, one of the things we actually realized was, the more we continue down the managed validator path, in the sense of like, yeah, we'll set it up for you and we'll run it for you, we become a bottleneck, and we start to inhibit decentralization, and we inhibit the scale of the Solana network. And so over the next here in the next couple of days, we'll push an update to our GitHub that will literally have the what I've told the team is, it needs to be the Frank friendly, which is really just Synonymous for Dummies guide to spinning up a validator. Anybody should be able to just walk through those configs, and then, as you said, go do the hard part of attracting stake and everything like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it just circles back again to that general focus of decentralization. Another thing here, this one looks like pretty simple one. Is there a time limit for the vesting period on NFTs? It's more so the vesting will last forever. It's just when it's used up, that year's worth of stake time.
Right.
So, for example, I could hold this NFT, forget to stake it for 20 of the days, come back in 5 years, throw it in the contract, and get those tokens out. So I think that addresses
Yep.
CBS's question. It looks like pay caution also did that. And then someone's just asking, will we know the price we're paying before we redeem the token? And if I remember with the Aurora model, there's a like 24-hour just period where no one can add, but you can reduce your contribution towards the IDO. Is that something similar?
So yeah, so that period, or there was a withdrawal period within like the Aurora and the Mango IDOs. We took that out,
Okay.
and here's why. So first of all, we don't. It's kind of like with our NFT. We're not looking for. I mean, candidly, we're not looking for. Or we are looking for people who believe in the project, believe in the long-term focus, because we're not going to. Like if the token were to launch and then start to drop, and people are saying, can the devs do something? The answer is like, that's not going to change anything for us. We are building something very specific, very building it, I think, very transparently, and have been very upfront. Literally from day one with our NFT mint, right? Where it's fun to talk about NFT floor prices, but if they were to drop, right, it's not going to change like our focus, and we're not going to like we don't monitor that. The withdrawal phase, the problem that we have with the withdrawal phase is that, in Mango and Aurora, you you both saw, or in both of those IDOs, you saw moments where large investors, large whales came in. They put a bunch of tokens or put a bunch of USDC in the very beginning, and then yoinked it out at the very end. And that obviously creates a huge, it creates the ability to manipulate the price very significantly. I think the Mango contract was a great attempt to create something that allowed for organic price discovery, that just happened to have a little bit of a flaw. And I kind of think, like what backs that thinking up, what makes me feel like we're on the right track with that is, like, when Rory did their IDO, they have the normal disclaimer, that you have to hit accept. But one of the disclaimers that they gave is that it literally says, like, if you still go to ido.aurori.io, I think it is, you can still see the site, and the disclaimer literally says, like, market manipulation may occur. That's not okay.
Yeah.
So as we were kind of thinking through it, I know some other projects they've tried to do some creative things around, like, well, let's only allow a certain amount of the withdrawal to come out, and so on and so forth. Again, we like the elegance of simplicity, and so and we also very much want to be viewed as a long-term hold, and so it's more important to us to protect the IDO from overt market manipulation, recognizing that no system is perfect, obviously, but we want to protect the IDO from market manipulation, and we also want to make sure that that the people that are participating that they see the long-term value of the project, and so I think that's it's. I know we've had some people that like the vast response has been very overwhelmingly positive, but of course there's been a few who are like, no, I want the ability to take these out, and to them I say sorry, but we're very focused on making sure that that we can have an IDO that doesn't need a disclaimer at the beginning that says, yep, this could be manipulated, and if it is, then tough.
Yeah, no, that's sweet. And that 100% makes sense, right? If you're whale, quote unquote, you can just throw all your stones at this IDO knowing, okay, I'm going to pull back half of them. But in the meantime of doing that, you're going to scare away a lot of these smaller people who's like, oh, shoot, I don't want to pay 18, 19, $25 for this token just for it to actually be trading at 15.
Right, exactly. And then what if you have people? What if you have the whale? Because the price of the token and the amount of USDC contributed, of course, all that updates in real time on the front end. But what if you have a whale that jumps in, right? And they do exactly what you just described, and then like, in the last couple of minutes they start to yoink their deposit to drive the price back down, because now they've, as you said, they basically priced out a bunch of people. But then what if you have then you also have, like, the people who are, they're going to watch as that massive amount of USDC comes out, the price of the token starts to drop, they panic, so they start to pull out, and it's just there's just the ripple effect on that is just it creates so much uncertainty for participants, and it's much more. We would much more prefer to make sure for people to understand, like, to have structure, to have certainty, that they know that, okay, if the site reads right now that the token has gone from 50 cents to $1, they know what they're getting into, as opposed to games being played. And that's one kind of leading indicator, I think, that tells us we're on the right track, because the discussion around how to best game the IDO in our Discord has come to a halt, because there is no way to game the IDO. And if you have an IDO that can be gamed, then do you really have true price discovery built into your IDO, or do you have games? Do you have manipulation?
Yeah, that's awesome and very well put. It looks like we're down to the end of questions here. People are starting to notice the dogs and such, but I would just want to thank you for jumping on here, Frank. I started to dive into research last night and the night before, and I was like, I really don't want to talk just about an IDO all stream. And I started diving in, and I'm like, okay, this is awesome. This pivot towards decentralized storage and seeing that, okay, you guys optimized RPCs for Solana.
Mhm.
Why not? Let's tackle this other problem. You already have the compute and the
Mhm.
storage. Let's make it happen. So it was amazing to see all of that. I'm excited to see the developments of the Shadow protocol itself. It sounds like it's already on the way. You guys have testers, you're starting to put out documentation, and it's really starting to snowball from here. Other than that, that's all I have for you. And I just wish you the best of luck moving
I
forward. It looks
appreciate it.
like
Thank you.
you guys don't need too much of it. You're just steamrolling through here. So it's amazing to see that. The support from the community has been amazing. And I'm just excited to see the innovation you guys bring. And you guys are really pushing. You are one of these driving forces behind. Look, Solana has a lot more scaling to do to get towards this goal of a million TPS or whatever the number is. And you guys are right here pushing just as hard as Solana Labs behind it to make this happen. And that's what we need in the space. So it's really cool to see this infrastructure being built with this sort of North Star of decentralization. So it's amazing to have you on, and I'll just wrap it up with that.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. It's really enjoyed it. A lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I typically do my own sign off here, but I think I just wrapped it up. So thank you everyone for joining in. Please go ahead and like and subscribe to the video. We'll have a ton more content, and I'll just put it like that. Definitely like the video because I'm sure we'll have Frank back on as more of the Shadow protocol is unfolding.